All right, let's begin tonight with the stock market. It had a very volatile day today. The Dow dropped more than 1,000 points today. That's just over 3%. But the index made a dramatic comeback right before closing. Investors stepped in to buy tech stocks, and the Dow ended the day up nearly 100 points. The S&P and NASDAQ ended up as well. Now, that's never happened before. The Dow has never closed up after being down by so much. Now, the stock markets are only one indicator of the economy. There's much more to it than Wall Street. But our latest NBC News poll shows us that the economy is probably on your mind a lot. 42% said that jobs and the economy are America's top issue right now. COVID came in second at 29%. 61% said that their family's income is falling behind the cost of living. Just under a third said they're kind of holding even. And 34% said that rising prices for gas and for groceries have impacted them the most. Clearly, a lot of families are struggling, and that struggle could get worse for an estimated 35 million families with no more child tax credit payments. So, what's next for the economy on Wall Street and on your street? Should we expect a sustained comeback or more trouble ahead? Let's begin tonight with NBC News Now anchor Allison Morris, who joins us here. And Allison, I don't want us to make too much of what we see on Wall Street today. So what can we extrapolate between Wall Street and the economy about what's going on in a bigger sense?
All right, so the good news is about that mess we saw today is that it's not the economy. You'll hear business people say this all the time. The stock market is not the economy. And some of the reasons why we know this about what happened today, the stock markets have been really jittery about the Fed, right? The Fed is meeting this week. We don't expect them to raise interest rates at this meeting, but we expect them to lay out the plan for the year. We're looking at maybe 4 interest rate hikes this year, probably starting in March. The markets are getting a little bit jittery about that. Now, a couple of things. The Fed doesn't raise interest rates when the economy is looking good or getting better. It generally tends to lower them. So one sign things are okay here. We also saw tech stocks taking a bit of a dip today. Tech stocks tend to have trouble when the Fed is about to raise interest rates. They're growth stocks. They don't do well in a situation like that. So we've got the Fed thinking about raising interest rates this spring, something it's also doing to deal with all of those issues that the Americans in that NBC News survey are concerned about. You raise interest rates when you want to get inflation under control, maybe try to help bring prices back. So what we're seeing today, not concerns about our economy being in trouble.
So I just want to dig a little bit more on the Fed, because the Fed feels very opaque to people who don't like watch the Fed, you know?
Of course.
Interest rates and inflate, like it gets very complex very quickly.
Sure does.
It sounds like part of what we're seeing is the Fed trying to deal with Main Street issues, inflation, cost of living, by affecting some interest rates. That same tactic, Wall Street interprets it differently depending on what they're investing in and what they're expecting. So it's kind of like two responses to the same potential future economic outcome.
So, yeah, there are a couple issues at play here. So one thing that the market doesn't love. When interest rates go up, the markets tend to cool off a little bit as well. Now, this isn't something to be particularly concerned about because the markets have been going up and up and up in spite of some of the problems that we've had, the pandemic. So they might cool off a little bit. That's why we've seen the market struggling a little bit in the start of this year. That's why we saw that 1,200-point swing. Now, I'm not a professional trader and I'm not an economist, but I listen to what a lot of them say. And a lot of them are saying this Fed put, as they're calling it, this play we've been seeing on concerns about the Fed, they think it might be nearing the end, that maybe what we saw today was overblown. The good news was what happened at the end of the day, right? We saw people getting back in the market saying, those tech stocks that went down today, they're a little bit more attractive to me at this price. Maybe I'll put some money back in here. You didn't see people running away from the market screaming, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, and I don't think people who are like worried about tech stocks are so upset about like the fundamentals of Apple, right? We know Apple's a staple company.
I'm not crying about Apple
No one's crying about Apple, right. So that part of the economy is going to be just fine. Well, you mentioned the stock swing as we led with. There is another figure that traders will look at quite a bit called the VIX.
Oh, I love me the VIX.
Yes, the VIX, the volatility index. It topped 38 today.
Whew.
Yeah, tell me about the VIX and what this means in terms of what the markets are looking at.
So you're looking at the VIX close right there. It closed at 29.9. For people who are thinking, Allison, Joshua, what the heck are you talking about? What's the VIX? The VIX basically measures how much fear is in the market. When the VIX is hanging out in the teens between 13 and 19, market's cool. We've got it together. We're okay. When the VIX starts to top 20, fear factor kicking in. When the VIX hits 38.94 like it did today, that's double the fear factor. People are freaking out. So it certainly came back down. But I was watching that today. It was like a roller coaster ride. We had a lot of nerves in the market today. I mean, a 1,200-point swing. We were looking at changes on the Dow today that we haven't seen since the pandemic started. On the NASDAQ, which is super tech-heavy, tech's been having so much trouble. We haven't seen the NASDAQ move around like this since the financial crisis of 2008. So this was not a common day on the markets. I was watching today at 345, 350 going, oh my gosh, what's happening here? Because this just was an odd day.
You know what Allison's normally doing at 345, 350?
Yeah, you know I was doing both of those things today.
You were doing both?
I had one eye on the teleprompter and one eye, because we were about to talk about the markets, and I was thinking, something must be wrong here. They're green. How did they become green?
How does that happen?
Yeah.
Well, that is one of the many things you can see Allison Morris talk about weekdays from 3 to 5 p.m. here on NBC News Now. Allison, good to see you. Thank you.
Great to be with you.
All right, let's stay with the Senate and a new campaign that's gotten a lot of attention. Last week, Democratic candidate Gary Chambers of Louisiana released his first campaign ad. It went viral for what he said and what he did while he said it.
Every 37 seconds, someone is arrested for possession of marijuana. Since 2010, state and local police have arrested an estimated 7.3 million Americans for violating marijuana laws, over half of all drug arrests. Black people are 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana laws than white people. States waste $3.7 billion enforcing marijuana laws every year. Most of the people police are arresting aren't dealers, but rather people with small amounts of pot, just like me. I'm Gary Chambers, and I'm running for the U.S. Senate, and I approve this message.
Campaign operatives from both major parties say they cannot remember an ad quite like this one. Mr. Chambers is looking to unseat Republican Senator John Kennedy. He was first elected in 2016, and another Democrat, Luke Mixon, has also declared his candidacy. Democratic Senate candidate Gary Chambers joins us now. Mr. Chambers, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me today.
I should note, by the way, we have also invited Senator Kennedy to speak with us if he so desires, and that invitation stands. Let me start with the ad. Talk us through why you decided to begin your campaign with an ad like that. It's pretty eye-catching.
Well, one of the things that we wanted to do is cut through the noise. You know, there's so much going on in the world today that most people won't even pay attention to a Senate race down in Louisiana, because they think it's unwinnable. But the truth is a Democrat is already our governor, and Louisiana has the capacity to turn this state blue the same way that Georgia did. And when we look at where we are as a country and where we are as a nation, we got to talk about the inequities and the justice issues that we have. And cannabis legislation is one of those things that can be impacted at the federal level to take some of the discrimination and inequity that exists out of it. Just this weekend, there were news reports in Rapides Parish, Louisiana, of someone being arrested because they had some pounds of cannabis, while the state of Louisiana is growing cannabis with our tax dollars, while California, Illinois, Virginia, Michigan, and a host of other states have legalized. We still have prohibition here and are sending people to jail for something that people are making millions of dollars for in other states.
Where did you shoot that ad? I mean, you shot the ad in a place where it's legal to shoot the ad, right?
We shot it in New Orleans, and so the organization that I run, Bigger Than Me, helped to further decriminalize cannabis in the city of New Orleans. So now there is a prospective pardon issued even if you were given a citation, which practically makes it legal to smoke cannabis for simple possession in New Orleans, which is why we chose to do it there.
What is it you'd like the Senate to do? If you were in the Senate right now, what would you be proposing?
Well, one of the things I'd be picking up the MORE Act out of the House and helping move that through the Senate. I think that it's legislation that is necessary in this country. I'd also be having conversations with the president to be true to the things that he said while he was candidate Biden as President Biden. President Biden as a candidate talked about decriminalizing cannabis use in this country, and that's something that I think needs to happen at the federal level. It should also be descheduled so that people all over this country could be able to use it without fear or repercussion of going to jail. These are things that our U.S. Senate has the capacity to pick up, but they need somebody who can be a strong leader on that, and I'm willing to do so.
And just so for those who don't know, the MORE Act, the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act, it would basically remove marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act, which would decriminalize it at the federal level. I wonder, Mr. Chambers, though, how you would get that done. I mean, the Senate which does not seem to be very good at moving a lot of legislation these days, even when it's something that a lot of Democrats support. We saw what just happened with the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. How would you work around senators like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema if they decided they did not want to support this? To be clear, I don't know whether or not they do, but if this legislation about cannabis began to go the same way as the legislation about voting rights, what would you do?
Well, one of the things is we're expanding our margin. When you add a senator from Louisiana to the Senate, you don't necessarily have that one vote threshold. You have one extra vote. We've got to help get other Democrats elected, such as in Florida and Wisconsin and Kentucky. There are bold people running for office in those states. And so this isn't just about me getting there, but expanding the margins that Democrats have there. What the problem is right now is that we have this simple vote majority, so one senator can hold the legislation hostage. What we need to do is grow the margins. And so I'm going to spend the time that I have not just helping get myself elected, but doing everything I can to lend my voice to help others get elected so that there are more of us there to be able to move this. You're right. You're absolutely right that one senator can hold up the process, and that's why more of us have to go there.
I hear you, but if you got elected and these other senators did not, let's say you're the only Democrat who breaks through in November. Let's say you're the one who can flip a seat. Does that mean that you've got to wait 2 more years to move anything forward in your agenda till Kyrsten Sinema's up for re-election, 4 more years until Joe Manchin's up for re-election? Or do you have plans for 2023 that don't depend on anyone else winning office?
Other than push the line. I mean, as anyone in the U.S. Senate has to do is have conversations with their colleagues about how you can make it happen. Some of the things that you can do is break a bill up. Sometimes you can't get the entire bill passed. You figure out what pieces of the legislation you can move to get things done. And so I'd be doing everything in my power to have conversations with people within my party and Republicans, because this isn't just a Democrat issue. This is a Democrat and Republican issue. Right now in Louisiana, we have Republicans in our state house leading the charge for legalization of cannabis. And I'd use those people as examples to talk to their fellow Republicans about it, because I think that we've got to break through some of this partisan stuff that exists and just have conversations with people about what's right for the American people. I can't make promises, but what I can do is say I'm going to go there and fight like hell to make it happen.
Let me ask you about a few other things that the Senate is dealing with. You would have to deal with more than just cannabis legislation, of course. I wonder what your thought is in terms of the future of voting rights. If you were in the Senate right now, what would you be doing now with regards to voting rights?
One, voting for it, if given the opportunity to vote for it. You just talked about the hurdles that you face with Manchin and Sinema. I don't know what one senator can do as it relates to that, other than to get the president to do whatever he can from an executive authority to put pressure on Senator Sinema and Senator Manchin. I'm not sure if I agree that the president has done everything he can to apply the type of pressure necessary to get them to move, but I think that that's what the Senate Democrats need to be leaning on, is figuring out how do you flip these 2 votes. If President Biden could get 80 million votes to become the president, surely he can figure a way to flip 2 votes in the U.S. Senate.
I appreciate you having a sense of the limitations of what you'd be able to do immediately outside of helping the president make his case. That is something that I think a lot of freshman senators maybe don't quite have a sense of. So I appreciate you saying that. Right now, the U.S. is sending more troops in the direction of Eastern Europe, just in case something happens in Ukraine. I don't know if you've given thought to where you stand policy-wise on that, but what do you think that the U.S. should be doing right now in case Russia decides to try something?
Well, I am always going to be in line with Dr. King's policies on war. When we look at where America is, we spent 20 years in war in Afghanistan and Iraq. It has not been a huge benefit to this nation, as we've seen over the months that just passed. What we want to do is find the most diplomatic solution to resolve the issues there. The reality is it's complicated. I'm not there in the Senate to have the briefings to understand the complexities of everything, but having a detailed plan of what are our diplomatic options and how we're going to roll those out is what I'd want to be looking at if I was a U.S. Senator, because I just don't believe that a war option benefits us or the people of Ukraine and Russia.
And I know I got to move on, but one last question. There are 24 committees in the Senate. Have you thought about which ones you'd like to serve on before we go?
Absolutely. Infrastructure and transportation is one for sure. How we get more money and resources to people in the state of Louisiana is a core thing. John Kennedy voted against the infrastructure bill. It's something that's bringing billions of dollars to our state. It's something I would have supported if I was a U.S. Senator. And given the opportunity, I want to do everything I can to help bring resources to help create more jobs, as well as fix our crumbling roads and bridges here in Louisiana.
Democratic Senate candidate Gary Chambers, I appreciate you making time, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you.
Up next, we will talk about the latest on Russia's standoff with Ukraine. The Biden administration says U.S. troops are ready to deploy if necessary. So how close is it to being necessary?
I want to reinforce that as of now, the decision has been made to put these units on higher alert and higher alert only. No decisions have been made to deploy any forces from the United States at this time.
How likely is a war right now between Russia and Ukraine? And how involved would the United States be? Today, the Pentagon tried to give us some answers.
As the president has said, even as we continue to prioritize diplomacy and dialogue, we must also increase readiness. In support of its obligations to the security and defense of NATO and the security of its citizens abroad, at the direction of the president and following recommendations made by Secretary Austin, the United States has taken steps to heighten the readiness of its forces at home and abroad so that they are prepared to respond to a range of contingencies, including support to the NATO response force if it is activated. All told, the number of forces that the Secretary has placed on heightened alert comes up to about 8,500 personnel.
Now, soon after that announcement, President Biden spoke with European leaders for about 90 minutes. A senior administration official told NBC News that the U.S. is in conversations with NATO countries about sending troops to Eastern Europe. However, the president has not ordered a deployment, at least not yet. Meanwhile, NATO is putting extra forces on standby. It's sending more fighter jets and ships to the region, beefing up presence in the Baltic Sea for deterrence. Russia has about 100,000 troops on Ukraine's border right now. And the State Department is moving family members of embassy staff out of the region. It's also getting non-emergency diplomatic employees out. NBC White House correspondent Mike Memoli joins us now with more. Mike, what more do we know about what happened at the White House? The president didn't talk very much about his conversations today.
No, not very much. We did hear from the president after that call with our European allies. He said simply that there was unanimity, a strong unanimity among the other participants in that call about what happens moving forward. Now, we know that that's not necessarily the case, because I think the fact that this call took place reminds us of what the president said last week at his news conference, when he perhaps said too much about the sort of variations of opinion among the European leaders who we are coordinating with as it relates to all things Russia and Ukraine. And the fact that should Russia, the easiest thing, let's say, for the U.S. and our allies to respond to, the easiest thing that they all agree on is a sort of traditional full-scale tanks rolling into Ukraine from Russia approach. That would then lead to the swiftest, strongest of the economic and potentially other sanctions that are being considered at the moment. What the president got in trouble by talking about is sort of what happens if there's a minor incursion, something that looks more like trying to destabilize the central government of Ukraine, not necessarily moving forces into Ukraine. That's why this call was taking place today, so that they could sort of walk through all those different scenarios. The White House has been talking consistently over the last 2 or 3 months now about sort of two paths, diplomacy and deterrence. We're hearing less and less about diplomacy, and we're even hearing less and less about the economic deterrence, and more about what we heard from the Pentagon today, which is military deterrence in the form of that new number of U.S. forces being put on ready alert.
Before I let you go, Mike, what about the State Department getting embassy staff out of Ukraine? How have the Ukrainians reacted to that?
The Ukrainians are not happy, and in fact, we saw something similar when the U.S. was weighing the calculation about our embassy presence in Kabul last summer. Some of the after-action reports finding that, in fact, the U.S. was wary of pulling more of our personnel out of Kabul because it would risk destabilizing Ukraine, and that's some of the early rumblings that we're hearing from Ukraine's government as well. What the White House is saying, the administration is saying, is obviously they're being prudent. They are following the same kind of common sense protection for their personnel that they would follow at any other embassy. And as it relates to all other Americans that are in Ukraine right now in Kiev, they're asking them to register essentially with the government. This is something that would allow them to get back in touch with any U.S. residents and U.S. citizens who are in Ukraine quickly should sort of the worst case scenarios unfold. At this point, though, still a lot of mystery about what exactly Putin's intentions are and just whether he's willing to follow through on what it looks like he's been building up towards.
Thank you, Mike. That's NBC White House correspondent Mike Memoli with the latest from Washington. Let's continue this conversation now with Dr. Evelyn Farkas. She's the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia region, and she's a former senior advisor to NATO's Supreme Allied Commander. Dr. Farkas, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Joshua.
What do you make of what the U.S. and NATO have been doing lately as it relates to the future of whatever might happen between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, here's the thing. So you and Mike mentioned the various avenues and approaches of the administration and its NATO allies. Obviously, there are the economic sanctions, which are being threatened now to try to deter Putin from making a further military move. Then you have these military deployments, and they are actually aimed at also deterring Putin, but we need to beef them up because the real threat is that we'll use them. So there's no reason to hold back right now. We need to send everything we can to signal to him that he cannot get away with doing any level of incursion into Ukraine. But in addition to that, the reason why I think the president said there was unanimity is because these new deployments are addressing the fact that the Russians just recently, in the last couple of days, put in new forces into Belarus. And Belarus shares a border with 3 NATO allies, Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania. So that's a direct threat to NATO. And yes, NATO is a defensive alliance, but if Putin dares put a boot into those countries, then you will have war. So you can see, Joshua, the stakes are really high. And the one thing that they're not doing enough of, I would argue, is not enough diplomatic pressure at the UN and from the global community. Because what's at stake here is literally the UN Charter, the United Nations, Article 2, which is the sanctity of borders. You cannot change borders since World War II using military force. If you try to do it, the international community will come down on you, as we did when Saddam Hussein tried to do it in Kuwait.
I wonder, though, if that did happen, if the U.S. and NATO made a stronger push toward Belarus, Russia, toward Ukraine, that whole region, I can imagine Vladimir Putin being like, okay, show me something. Here, it's like you tell him not to cross that line, he goes, fine, I just crossed it. What you gonna do? It almost, I wonder how we do that without getting pulled into a war just because Vladimir Putin has nothing to lose and we well might.
Well, listen, everything he's done has contributed to escalation. We have not contributed to the escalation. We have responded to him. What I would like is if we were more proactive. And there are things we can do that are not military. I mentioned the United Nations. We also could put out our own dossier, like his opposition did in Russia, about all of Putin's corruption and all the money he and his cronies have and the things that they've done. But I think that we have to make it clear to the Russian government that if they do take a step, as you said, into Ukraine, the consequences will be really high. And I've argued for more than just tactical assistance. We need air defenses at the strategic level for the Ukrainian government. We need maritime defenses. And I'm glad to see that we will have NATO forces in the Black Sea, enforcing freedom of navigation and trying to take some of the pressure off of Ukraine. But we need to throw the kitchen sink in now because we don't want to get in a war with Russia and we don't want Ukrainian people to die needlessly.
Well, that kind of gets to what my next question was going to be. Suppose the U.S. does get militarily involved on the ground in Ukraine in one way or another. Well, on the ground or in the air. I hear your argument in terms of air defenses. I think the main question for John and Jane Q. American is this worth it? Like, is war with Ukraine really worth American interests? Why does this matter to the everyday American? What are we going to get out of this? We have much bigger things to worry about right now than getting mired in another war over there. Is U.S. military involvement in Ukraine, for lack of a better way to put it, worth it?
So, Joshua, first of all, we are going to do everything we can to avoid that. That means providing assistance from far away from the battlefield, right? And if U.S. troops get injured somehow or killed by Russians, even if it's a mistake, they will defend themselves. And we saw that in Syria. But we have ways of communicating with the Russians so that it doesn't escalate. In Syria, when our special operations forces were attacked by Russian contractors, they fought back and over 100 Russians died. So the Russian government should know that if anything happens to Americans, they will fight back and there will be a price to pay. So hopefully it will not come to that. But what is at stake here is, I'm not kidding, nothing less than the international order. If Russia gets its way in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin will turn around and he will threaten the Baltic states, because they used to be part of the Soviet Union, and he thinks he should continue to have a sphere of influence there. He will threaten other countries, maybe even other NATO members like Poland. He said that he doesn't want NATO forces in Bulgaria and Romania, other NATO members. He's not going to stop until he has a sphere of influence. Well, sphere of influence means rolling back to pre-World War II system of international order, which was disorder. It was competitive. And that's why we set up the UN, again, as I said, with the charter that said, you may not like the borders where they are, but you cannot change them using military force. You have to negotiate any changes.
Before I have to let you go, what do you think, if anything, is the red line for Vladimir Putin? To me, he doesn't really seem to be particularly deterred or swayed by anything that has to do with the international order, so I'm not sure how close to the brink his brinksmanship might go. Do you believe there's anything that for Vladimir Putin would be a red line, would make him retract, or is he just going to keep going and force the West's hand in this?
So Putin and his officials have used incredibly alarming language, Joshua, and they have a nuclear first use policy where if they feel the survival of their state is threatened, which of course they are the ones who determine that, then they can use nuclear force, they can use tactical nuclear weapons. They have a military doctrine of escalating to de-escalate, meaning they could launch a huge cyber attack on the United States to try to keep us out of a conflict. So he doesn't have a lot of red lines or restrictions on what he would do. I would argue that the way he's thinking about it is not in terms of what are red lines or what are things he considers unacceptable. It's what is the lowest price he can pay to get what he wants, which is full control over Ukraine. He does not want a democracy over the borders. So he will do whatever incursion he can, but he may think he can't just take another bite of the apple and get his way. So that's the danger.
Dr. Evelyn Farkas, I appreciate you talking this through with us tonight. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joshua.
Up next, a big admission from former Pope Benedict. What he's saying now about a meeting decades ago involving an abusive former priest. We're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. Pope Benedict XVI faced a number of questions about abuse in the Catholic Church. A recent statement has turned the world's attention back to this again. Today, the former Pope's private secretary admitted to a meeting in 1980. At that meeting, church officials discussed a priest accused of sexual abuse. In a previous statement, Pope Benedict had said that he was not there. He now blames the discrepancy on an editorial mistake. According to the private secretary, quote, he would like to emphasize that this was not done out of bad faith, but was the result of an error in the editing of his statement. He's very sorry for this mistake, and he apologizes for this mistake, unquote. All of this stems from a German report released a few days ago. The report claims that this pope failed to act against 4 priests accused of child sexual abuse while he was Archbishop of Munich from 1977 to 1982. Joining us now is Walter Robinson, the editor-at-large of the Boston Globe and the former editor of the Spotlight team. You may remember Michael Keaton played him in the movie Spotlight. Mr. Robinson, welcome.
Good to be with you, Joshua.
What do you make of this latest development in this whole matter involving Pope Benedict?
Well, in a way, it's earth-shattering, but in a way, it's not surprising at all. What the law firm hired by the Archdiocese of Munich found was that, in fact, then Cardinal Ratzinger was, in fact, involved in the cover-up of cases of childhood sexual abuse. Today, there was an apology. He had said he was not at a crucial meeting in 1980. He now admits he was, that he misunderstood the situation. It was an editorial mistake. But the fact of the matter is that the revelation that he was involved in the cover-up was no surprise. That in fact, around the world, certainly in the United States, in many, many dioceses, the bishops and the archbishops were playing from the same script. That they kept secret the abuse by priests. They moved the priests around. When people came forward with claims, they settled them in secret, all to preserve the reputation of the church. And nowhere in any of this was there any mention or concern for the harm done to thousands and thousands of children.
Is Pope Benedict considered credible in this matter? He's clearly a key figure in the investigation, but how much weight do his words have these days?
Well, they don't. First of all, he's 94 years old and he's infirm. So, you know, the fact that he was not at the meeting and then corrected that is not as important as the fact that he, when he was Pope, he did not discipline a single bishop who engaged in the cover-up. And the reason is that he too was engaged in the cover-up of the abuse within his own diocese, archdiocese in Munich.
How does this fit into the rest of the cases we've seen with regard to child abuse from Catholic priests over the years? Is this a larger case in the scheme of things? Does this just kind of fit into the lattice work of everything else? How would you contextualize this?
Well, I would say, Joshua, more the latter. It fits into the lattice work of the other cases. You remember in 2002 when the Boston Globe exposed the extent of the abuse in Boston, which involved 250 priests. The Cardinal Archbishop of Boston, Bernard Law, resigned and was given a cushy post in the Vatican. And there were lots of complaints at the time. How could they take care of him in this way? The fact is that Cardinal Law simply, if you will, took a bullet for the team. He didn't do any more or less than other bishops or archbishops did. In fact, the evidence is that in up to 3/4 of the dioceses in the United States, the bishops all were engaged in the same sort of cover-up.
I wonder, and you just said 2002, I can't believe it's been 20 years since that report. Yeah. It feels in some ways like a lot has changed in terms of the way we talk about sexual abuse in institutions, whether they're churches, universities, the U.S. Olympic team. You know, we've had these conversations in a different way, and I think Spotlight is one of the factors that's involved in that. Before I have to let you go, though, where do you see this going from here? It's been 20 years since Spotlight. Do you believe that this is leading over time to more accountability in the Catholic Church?
Ever so slowly, Joshua. The Catholic Church still doesn't seem to get it, and they need to vote for transparency. That there are too many places around the world where the church is still not admitted that priests abuse children on such a massive scale. Everywhere that we have good data, 10% of the priests abuse children. And, you know, in Buenos Aires, where Pope Francis served as the Cardinal Archbishop, he claimed that no priest abused children there. And that's simply ridiculous. And the church has yet to have a full reckoning for this.
Walter Robinson, editor-at-large of the Boston Globe. Mr. Robinson, thank you very much.
Thank you, Joshua.
Did you get a stimulus check last year? What about child tax credits? Well, both of them play into this year's tax season, which started today. We will answer some of your tax filing questions just ahead. Stay close. Today is the official beginning of tax season. You have until April 18th to file your 2021 returns. Still, this is a good year to get a head start for your sanity's sake. Maybe you got a stimulus check, maybe you received child tax credits, or maybe you use a platform like Venmo or PayPal for your business, including that side hustle. Well, all these things are going to factor into how you will file this year. But it's not just harder for you. The IRS has a backlog of 6 million returns from last year. 6 million. And the agency is so understaffed, it might not be able to pick up your phone call. Now, according to the National Taxpayer Advocate, that's an independent organization within the IRS that reports to Congress. According to the National Taxpayer Advocate, last fiscal year, the IRS got a record 282 million phone calls. 11%, 1 in 10, got answered by a human being. So let's answer some of your tax questions and hopefully spare you from being stuck on hold. Joining us to help answer those questions is Michelle Singletary, a nationally syndicated personal finance columnist for The Washington Post. She is the author of What to Do with Your Money When Crisis Hits, a Survival Guide. Miss Singletary, it is so good to see you again. Welcome.
Yeah, so good to see you too. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too. Can we just start with that point in terms of the backlog at the IRS? And a question from Brian. Brian asks, so what I'd like to know is when my 2020 taxes will finally be processed, along with almost everyone else I know that is self-employed, still waiting. SBA, the Small Business Administration, SBA needs this information for loans, but everything is on hold until they actually process last year's returns. Michelle, what's our best read on just how bad it's going to be with the IRS this year, especially since they got that backlog?
Yeah, it's going to be bad. I wish I had better news for people. They're still digging out the hole that was really recreated because of the pandemic. Now, things are bad. We're challenging before the pandemic. It was hard to get through, but there wasn't that big backlog. And so now, I hate to say it, but you just have to be patient. There isn't anything that you can do to speed the process. If you file a paper return, you know, I'm with you. It's going to be a tough slog because they're getting to that last. And so it's going to be a long road. So all you can do is just keep checking. If you do a refund, you can check where's my refund on irs.gov to see if there's any update. It only updates once a day, so you don't have to keep checking it all during the day. Just wait it out. That's all I can tell you to do right now.
Sarah tweeted with a question I think a lot of people have. Sarah asked, will last year's stimulus payments really affect refunds on our amounts due? Michelle?
Yeah, the stimulus payments are not impacted, so that's your money. It's not going to cause any issues unless you have back child support. Other than that, all that money should come to you. That was part of the package because they didn't want that money to be reduced. So you shouldn't have to worry about that. That doesn't mean that you might not owe taxes based on the rest of your tax return. And if you owe money, you can certainly use that to offset what you owe. But there shouldn't be any money taken out of your stimulus money coming to you.
We got an email from Scott who explained some of his situation. He asked two questions. We'll start with the first one. Scott wrote, I moved from Virginia to New Jersey beginning of January 2021 for health reasons and to be closer to family and friends. Quit my job in April 2021 due to stress levels and anxiety issues. May I claim relocation expenses for medical reasons and while I was still employed? Michelle?
So, you know, with these specific types of questions, the best thing is to talk to a tax professional because they can look at your whole tax situation. I know people want quick answers, and I also know that people don't want to pay for that kind of advice. But I'm telling you, if you got this kind of situation and you're not sure what you're eligible for, please hire a tax professional. It's going to be a challenging year. It was last year. It's going to be this year and also in 2023 for that matter. So the best advice I could get you for your individual tax situation is to talk to a professional so they can walk through everything and find out whether or not you still can get that deduction.
I hear you in terms of specialized advice. And, you know, if you start now, you've got between now and April 18th to figure everything out. I do wonder, though, if there are certain general landmines that it looks like more people are going to step on this year because of what the economics of 2021 were. Any big things that most everybody should be keeping an eye out for?
So if you qualify for the child tax credit, a couple of things. So if you were able to get those advance payments, the IRS is going to be sending you a letter. I know when you get mail, you freak out, you don't want to open it, you're not understanding it, but you must look at that letter and make sure it matches up with what you got, because families only got half of what they were due for the plus up child tax credit payment. So you got to collect the rest of that when you file your 2021 return this year. So look for that letter from the IRS, match it up with what you had. If there's some discrepancy, I hate to tell you to call the IRS, but you're going to have to call, so that you make sure that when you file your return, you have the right information on it. This is not the year to make a mistake on your tax returns, because if it gets pulled out of the pile, you're going to go at the back of the line in terms of getting some help. So the IRS is emphasizing this. Tax professionals, please check the math, check all the forms, read everything that's coming in, all the tax forms, so that when you file, it is as correct as possible. This is and don't procrastinate. File as soon as you can, as soon as you get all your documents.
Right quick, I want to ask you about something you recently wrote about in the Washington Post, the new policy that requires Venmo, PayPal, and other payment apps to report to the IRS if you're making more than $600 a year through these platforms, kind of on that side hustle. Talk about what self-employed workers and gig workers need to know, Michelle, briefly about this year's taxes.
Yeah, right. So this won't impact this year's taxes that you're going to start filing actually today. This is for the 2022 tax year. I know it's all confusing, right? 2021, 2022, but you file this year's stuff next year. So starting this year, however, if you sell on any of those platforms or you get money, they have to send to the IRS if you make more than $600. That's total. So it's not per, sell. So some people's like, well, I'll just sell something for $5.99. No, it's $600 total. And it really isn't a new tax. It's a new reporting requirement. So if anybody has used Venmo or Cash App, or I used PayPal recently, a little screen popped up to confirm your tax information. Now, if you're receiving money, you're splitting meals, grandma sending you money, you sending grandma money, this is not what they're talking about. They're talking about business enterprises. And you were always supposed to report that income, whether they sent you a 1099-K or not.
Michelle Singletary, I appreciate you making time to answer some questions. Good to see you. Thank you very much.
Good to see you too. Thank you.
And hey, if you still have some lingering questions about your taxes, go ahead and send them our way. We'd love to hear more from you. We're at NBC Now Tonight on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. You can always leave us a voicemail, 888-575-2NBC, or email us nowtonight@nbcnews.com. Well, that brings tonight's performance to a close, but until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. We'll see you back here on this stage tomorrow. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.